Good to see you, everyone. My name is Robbie Howell, and today marks a rather momentous occasion in my life. On this very day, September 25th, 10 years ago, I hosted the first ever Enclave mission in my dormitory room during sophomore year for two friends of mine who had been playing my games before, but I finally convinced them to give this new weird game that I'd been working on a try. This was far from the first time I had played Enclave in any form. I had been beta testing and iterating through multiple designs for about 3 or 4 years before this climactic first mission. But this is the 10th anniversary of the first Enclave mission as we would recognize it today. I remember that mission like it was the back of my hand. It wasn't good. It was honestly pretty bad. It went very overtime, and we ended up finishing past midnight. Hence, the 26th is also technically the anniversary day as well. And since then, Enclave has seen an awful lot of changes. The game is recognizable, but it is still... It's recognizable, but only barely, I guess is the way that I would say it. And it finally leads us to where we are now, with the game being finally published in some form, with the PDFs being out. I'm going to be taking this opportunity to not only answer questions that have been asked of me about Enclave over the recent months of promoting the game, frequently asked questions that I have never answered in a public forum before, at least not sufficiently, as well as any questions that people throw me in chat or have thrown to me in DMs leading up to this. Then at the end, we're going to give a little roadmap of Enclave, where I anticipate the game going over the next couple years. I'm not going to be able to give any firm dates, of course, but I can give you a very good idea of the content therein. Okay, so yeah, 10th anniversary of Enclave, and I will be tomorrow hosting a anniversary mission with two of the earliest Enclave players. In fact, they were the two people who were on that very first mission 10 years ago, along with a third who was, I think, one of the first 4 or 5 people to ever try the game out. So we're getting the old gang back and seeing what we can make happen. So to begin, I wanted to give the opportunity to do some questions if you guys have any in chat. I also have some that I have been sent and prepared in advance because Enclave is it's a recognizable game. I found that it's quite intuitive to jump in and play, but there's still some elements of it that are not going to be immediately obvious. One of which being, why aren't there explicitly defined fantasy races in Enclave, or species as I prefer to call them? I've been asked this on a number of occasions. People are used to playing their dwarves and their half-orcs and all that happy horse shit. But in my experience, especially for this more introductory iteration of the game, it is already hard enough to be character acting in a compelling way within the context of Enclave as is, especially when so much is demanded of you from the game, including things like altered states and trying to act out exhaustion and being affected by magical effects that also affect your acting, and then to put on top of that you're trying to play a character that isn't even human, unless they're so recognizable that they're just functionally human with a different skin tone. I don't know that that's reasonable to expect. Oh, excuse me. Yes, love. Okay, where was I after being so rudely interrupted?
I love you.
Yeah, so I was talking about non-human fantasy species in Enclave and how, considering that the game is quite character acting intensive, I didn't feel like it was a good idea to layer yet another element of character acting on top of all that. Of course, I do still extend the opportunity for people to be able to just kind of say that their character isn't a human. That's perfectly fine. But I do have plans going forward to introduce more conventional fantasy species into the game that have a good deal more involved mechanics and elements to them than the kind of skinning that you can do right now that just allows you to change your aesthetics and visuals and maybe give yourself a couple of pros and cons as long as they're balanced out. I have plans for far more in-depth iterations of that going forward. Just didn't want to lead with it because the game already demands quite a lot of you. So that's one of the questions I've been asked a couple of times when I was out promoting the game that I felt like would be a good one to mention here. Another topic that I thought would be important to kind of cover at the moment is whether Enclave can be played with dice if a playgroup really likes a lot of what's going on, but just really wants to have that extra tether. And my general answer to that is, yeah, probably. A friend of mine at one point said, maybe you should put a rule for that into the book just in case people want it. And the contrarian in me really wanted to keep it pure, you know what I mean? So I ended up not adding any explicit mechanics for it into the rule set. But if someone said to me, oh yeah, we've been playing and loving it, and what we do is that we just like add a d6 in once in a while if we're having a really hard time making a decision, I would not begrudge that whatsoever. The game is very pliable, and I strongly encourage different playgroups to kind of experiment with their own iterations and versions of it. And another one that I wanted to address is class power disparity. It's not obvious when looking at the 6 Enclave classes in this edition how all of them slot in to conventional gameplay. Something that's like I've heard a couple of times is, why would I ever play a Wanderer when I can play a Thunderbird? Because the Thunderbird is so powerful and flashy and cool. And the Wanderer, I mean, yeah, it seems fun, but it doesn't seem like it does anything particularly impactful. And that is where I get into the balancing trade-off between power and utility. Now, obviously, there's a lot more to it than just that. But at the very base level kind of assumption, Enclave likes to trade off power with utility in a lot of its design. Like the Gunslinger and the Thunderbird tend to be quite high power classes that have relatively low utility. Whereas classes like the Librarian and Wanderer tend to be very high utility and lower power. That being said, power versus utility is not the only dimension that we design off of with Enclave. There's a third one that there's a couple of them, but at a surface level, there's a third one that I like to go into, which is called, I call it at least, implications. Namely, you have your power, you have your utility, those are pretty obvious, but how much does a given class open the door to something really weird, the unexpected? How many wild cards does a class have up their sleeve? And how pliable is it to things like energy work? Energy work is such a huge part of the game, and you look at certain abilities and you can just say to yourself, oh, I know exactly how I'm going to be able to energy work that and play around with it and make it do interesting, funky things. Perfect example would be the Illusionist. Their ability Phantasm is just an absolute canvas for energy work, and it allows that class to get away with having much lower power because it has this not only great flexibility, but even then the Illusionist's flexibility is not as substantial as something like a Wanderer because it has a lot more like hard limitations on what it can and can't do. Instead, a lot of its power comes from its implications. Though the Librarian and the Wanderer are also quite implications-y because, frankly, any ability that lets you interface with a plot, such as Fun Fact or Familiar Face, automatically scores high on the implications scale. So power, utility, implications. 3 of the foremost design axes that I operate on when working with Enclave. So those are a couple of questions that I thought would be important to address. Obviously, if I think of more, I'll throw them out. If you guys watching have any, you're welcome to throw them out as well. I will be getting to them as promptly as I can. And in the meantime, let me quickly double check some of the other questions that I got. Okay, I'm not going to read off names just in case the people in question don't want to be like explicitly mentioned by name. Okay, that one we already addressed in the questions channel. How about, oh, this one's fun. Nice. So for abilities like that are rewriting pieces of the mission, quote unquote, like Fun Fact and Familiar Face, how do you square that logically in context of Magic in universe? We did kind of talk a bit about this in the questions section, but someone sent me a follow-up. So there's a couple of different ways you can look about this. First of all, I try very explicitly not to define exactly how and why Magic works in Enclave. First of all, because I want to give players the ability, and like playgroups and conduits, the ability to bring their own interpretations wherever possible. 2, because it would be very complicated. 3, because I think it would be boring. And 4, because I feel like so often a class brings its own grounding and rationalization to Magic. I don't think a unifying theory would be productive. In Enclave's history, we did try to have unified theories of Magic on a number of different occasions. I'm very fond of many of them. And if left entirely to my own devices, I would probably use those interpretations in my own games. And I do quite frequently. It's just not the sort of thing I am comfortable with projecting onto everyone else's play experience, if that makes sense. And so, but specifically for plot interfacing abilities, again, focusing on fun fact and familiar face, there's a couple of ways you can look at it. One, with something like familiar face, as I mentioned in the questions channel, you can look at it as being a matter of memory. You can say, oh yes, this is something that has happened, but both the target and the player character have forgotten about it, or it's like largely kind of drifted out of their minds. It's not at the forefront until the ability brings it all back into sharp relief with all of like a flood of memories and kind of the old feelings resurfacing all in a sudden rush. That's one way you can do it if you really want to make sure that kind of logically fits into the world. Fun fact, you can kind of do similarly, like, oh, I just remembered something. So I think memory is the best way of doing it if you really want to remain internally, logically consistent. But I would push back on that being the only way to do it. I mean, I'm sure there's quite a few that I won't touch upon now, but one of the most, I think, important ways that we can look at this is that, yes, the magic is actually rewriting the history, and that's okay. One, because you see this happen in media all the time, where something happens that seems to completely rewrite or at least reframe and recontextualize what the story has been leading up to at this point. It feels like it comes out of nowhere. What if that's the magic? What if that is what the magic is doing? And you can say, well, that's terrifying. That has such huge implications. Yes, it does. But since the tangible effect is quite small and quite bounded, it is not too implications-y as to make me terrified to introduce that as a precedent. That being said, if you found that your playgroup started to really abuse that precedent, I might recommend backpedaling, to say the least. Excellent question. Let's look at another. Okay, here's another good one. Vitality is kind of a weird stat. Why does vitality help with attention grabbing? That's a really good question. So vitality has been a problem child for quite a while. 12 is an important number to me, and I knew from the outset that I wanted Enclave to have 12 stats, and I had a very clear idea of how these stats would kind of fit together into the game's unifying vision. But vitality has shifted in terms of its actual niche and what it does on a number of occasions. It's always been this kind of, how do I describe it? It's been kind of a tank support stat, if I had to boil it down to like more conventional video gaming terms. And because it's a tank support stat, it always has had kind of elements of taking hits and drawing the heat off of your team, as well as bolstering and helping your allies in some way. And way back when we had like HP in Enclave, and it was the most vague, rough outlining of HP, like how much blood you have in you, which was very, very dumb. I don't want to do that one anymore. That was most of what Vitality did, and it felt very redundant with Resilience, and it just made tanks much weaker because you had to tech into 2 stats. So when we were looking at this iteration of Enclave, which, I mean, for me was awesome because it gave me this wonderful opportunity to kind of redesign the game in the way that I started to see it needing to be redesigned. My Legacy game was wonderful, and I loved it, and I have so many fantastic memories of it, but we got entrenched in a lot of precedents that I didn't think would be conducive to a game that I was bringing to market. And so it gave me a chance to say, let's look at Vitality with completely fresh eyes. Rallying, I think, is pretty obvious. Like, that's a very... You hear Vitality and you're like, yeah, I can see why it does that. But the attention-grabbing thing, why does it do that? Well, first of all, it still plays into the tank support idea, because what is a tank doing in a more conventional video game sense? It is drawing attention off of its allies. It's taking the heat off of them. It's redirecting attacks. And something that we started to notice in Legacy Enclave is we were giving almost every class some sort of attention-grabbing effect somewhere in its kit, because that's just such an important thing to be able to do. And you can say, well, can't you just yell? Yes, you can, but it's very easy to ignore being yelled. And so having something that would supernaturally help you grab attention and hold it, that ended up being just incredibly powerful in an Enclave context. That's something that I've learned about the game over the years, is that sometimes things in Enclave are just really strong that you wouldn't expect to be strong in a game, but they end up being like absolute centerpieces of the way the game is played, and a key part of its balance. And this was one of them. And so I was like, if we're putting this mechanic on so many stats, or so many classes, shouldn't it just be a stat? And shouldn't it just be Vitality? Because, hey, first of all, the concept of vitality. You're big, you're larger than life. That's going to be grabbing attention. The personality that vitality has associated it fits with this effect. And on top of all that, it's still like I said, it's still a tank support effect, and it's something that a lot of characters and classes will really, really want, regardless of what exactly they are. It even has social implications. And so because of that, vitality ended up getting the attention-grabbing effect. Kind of weird, kind of funky, and something that new players will very often kind of underrate, I think, but something that as you grow into the game, you'll see is very, very useful. Along similar lines, this next question, ooh, I like this one. Why in a game as social as Enclave, why do you not have a charisma stat? Aha, well, don't you see? That's the very reason why we don't have a charisma stat, is because in Enclave, we like to have the player's own acting be what is conveying charisma. Obviously, there are going to be some supernatural effects that are brought into play that will affect social interactions. Like, for example, the Wanderer on their walking stick has that aggression reduction effect, and that's going to really help you out. But I wanted to really, at all costs, avoid a stat. I mean, I didn't know this going into designing the game, but over the years, I've started to crystallize this. I wanted to avoid having a stat that did your acting job for you. Like the might stat, for example, might does not win you fights. It's obviously a hugely important tool, but it doesn't just say you win the fight. And in my experience, charisma stats oftentimes in games just say you win the social engagement. And so for a game like Enclave, where social is so huge, I didn't want to have a stat that just solved that. And so instead, a lot of stats have relevance in social engagements. Spirit and vitality are front and center. Skill is kind of an underrated one there. Intelligence obviously helps a lot. Sensory is huge. There's a lot of stats that help, just like how in a fight, you have a whole litany of stats that are going to help you substantially. But none of them do it for you. And that's what I really wanted to make sure was the case. This was a bad habit I noticed us getting into in Legacy, where we were giving too many classes mechanics and benefits and effects that gave them directly improved their social abilities in a way that felt excessive and kind of undermined the player's own acting efforts. So yeah, that's why we don't have a charisma stat of any kind in Enclave, though you could argue vitality comes kind of close. Okay, and I think that's going to be all the questions I was sent in advance. Again, if you guys have any other questions, and we'll see if more filter in as we are going, or if I think of any more. But at this point, I want to tell you all a little bit about my future plans for Enclave. And I do have quite a few of them. I have been known to have plans in Enclave. Now, okay, this does have a screen share effect. I don't know if I want to share my notes directly, because I don't want, things are very liable to change. And are very, obviously, design processes will bear things out differently than how it could be. But how about this? Okay, this is sneaky. We'll do that. All right. This is my current note document for the next edition's outline. I'd say that, so I think we're at 27 total pages for the outline. And if you exclude this stuff at the end, which is stuff I'm not including in this edition, it's more like 24, 25. I would say that on top of all the stuff that you see here, just outline-wise, I'm probably going to have another 4 or 5 pages of wrap-up notes. So that is quite a lot of content that I have planned for the next edition, the Aspirant edition. And what exactly is this content going to entail, you may ask? Well, not only am I going to try to build off of everything that we have in the game right now, in a way that doesn't repeat anything, such that not only will this next Aspirant edition be as streamlined as possible and won't just waste pages repeating stuff, but also so that the Advent edition you all have now is not rendered invalid by this one. The books will build off each other. So I'm going to try to building off of a lot of the stuff that we have now, while also introducing a bunch of new mechanics. Not only is, for example, character creation going to get more complicated, if you want it to, but also Much more importantly, we're going to have progression be a much bigger deal in this edition. Leveling is going to be far more complicated. You're going to have a lot more options for your gear and your loadout. A lot of what you see in the progression pages in Advent Edition that's going to be one of the big focuses for expansion in this next edition, giving you tons of new ways to build and develop your characters over time. Along similar lines, the stats are going to be slightly expanded, especially a few of them that I couldn't give as much complexity to in this particular edition as I wanted. So a few stats are going to get some slight expansions. And on top of all that, of course, classes. We're going to be getting, at minimum, 6 more classes. And the one thing I'm going to repeat from this edition is the 6 classes that you see here, because all classes are being expanded substantially. Right now, classes can fit on 2 pages. From the mock-ups I've been doing for Aspirant, each class is going to take 6 pages. Not only will classes have double the amount of gear and double the amount of abilities, but they are also going to have a couple other fun little bits thrown in there, including a good deal more advice and suggestions on how to both play and host for those classes. And some expansions to the League of Legends style stat blocks that I have on combat, utility, social. I'm expanding that a little bit more so that you can just scan through and know at a glance whether a class is what you're hoping for or not. So that's pretty cool. On the ability front, the 3 new abilities classes are going to be called advanced abilities. This is a core part of the game and has been since its very outset. Advanced abilities you do not have from the beginning. So you could technically build a character who just had the 3 that you have on in Advent right now, the basic abilities. But instead, once you get a basic ability to a certain level, once you've designed a certain number of perks for it, as you can see in the progression section, you get a choice to unlock an advanced ability. And the advanced abilities, on average, tend to be much more powerful, but much more specific. And so because of that, it really lets you kind of hone in your playstyle if you want to, or you could keep it all basics, keep it nice and rounded. And so you can look forward to a lot more fun powers for all of your classes. Another thing that is relevant to classes in Aspirant Edition is that while there are 2 that I'm almost 1,000% sure are going to be in there, the remaining 4-ish, I'm going to see how much of those I can let be voted on by the community in the Discord server. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give a couple of different options for what classes I'm considering and see what people want to see most out of those options within a certain niche. So if I say, I want to get a double plus spirit class in here. Here's some options I'm considering for double plus spirit classes. What do you guys like best? Because that's fun. I love crowdsourcing that sort of designs. And I think it will be some really great opportunity for you guys to have your voices be heard. Along similar lines, I'm probably going to do similar things for the stretch goals for the next campaign. My hope is that we can launch another Kickstarter, much like we've done with this, but now that I know what I'm doing more, it should go even better than this time did. And since the book is going to be substantially bigger, the classes alone are going to be longer than Advent Edition. I'm going to be trying to be a little more ambitious with my campaign. So we'll see how that goes, and hopefully it's pretty fun. That is my plan just for Aspirant Edition. That's the next one. What about beyond that? Well, Legacy Enclave is a monster. It's a very, very, very big game that has a whole lot of stuff that I couldn't fit into Advent Edition. I've gone on record saying that probably 10% of my Legacy game is in Advent Edition, and in retrospect, if you include the classes, it's probably substantially less than that. In Legacy, we had over 120 classes with plans for easily triple that number. And we'd actually written out and designed and extensively play tested quite a few classes, which of course are going to be getting a facelift and some changes being ported into this edition of the game, but are still going to be very recognizable from their legacy selves. And so my hope is that we can have a whole new, like obviously the 12 we're going to be getting in Aspirant is going to be nice. It's going to be 6 on top of the ones that we have, the 6 we have here, and then a few more coming in through stretch goals. But after Aspirant, I want to start looking into releasing classes without rules surrounding them. Or maybe, if not that, releasing bundles of some kind that features a couple of classes and then a bunch of pre-con content, like some examples of missions that you could run, or settings you could do, or some world building if you wanted to partake in that, or like, you wanted to see my take on that. Or some examples of loot or consumables you can give. So all kind of themed around some sort of unifying idea. And my hope with that, this would be one of the ways that we can like continuously put out new stuff about the game, and also increase that ever important total class number up, hopefully someday, to the levels that we saw in Legacy. But that's just the classes. We got from Detour. Want to see a monster manual but for classes? Yeah, that's kind of the hope, is that I can release big chunks of classes all at a time. And so on top of these kind of class releases, and again, the exact details of how those will look and when they'll be coming out, no idea. I do not think I would be kickstarting those. I don't think so. They would, I mean, the art would be pretty expensive, but like, I don't know. I don't know if I'll need to. That remains to be seen. But anyways, besides these bundle ideas that's kind of bouncing around in my head, the other piece of future news is that in addition to Aspirant, I have plans for 2 more rule set expansions. So Advent, Aspirant, and then tentatively named Adept and Ace. And each of these 2 additional these 2 further additions on top of Advent and Aspirant will introduce more complexity, more mechanics, and of course, more classes. I'm hoping for like between 6 and 12 new classes per rule set expansion. And the types of mechanics that will be featured in these are going to be substantially more involved than what we will see in, obviously we see in Aspirant, but also what we would, that we see in Advent, but also what we will see in Aspirant. For example, one of the things that I'm hoping to put into one of these later editions are things like proficiencies, or so like things that you are good at beyond just your character's abilities, defining skills and talents that they have. How about, as another example, negative stats? Well, how does it look when you have -1, like instead of a plus to might, a minus to might? And what trade-off benefit will you get for doing so? As another example, what if you could go higher than level 10? That's another thing I'm toying around with. And the list goes on. There's a whole lot of ideas that I have planned for these later editions that I don't want to get into too much detail on, because I don't know exactly which edition is going to get what. All I do know is that these two later editions after Aspirant are likely to be shorter than Aspirant, probably like between Aspirant and Advent in terms of their total length, and would also highlight a bunch of completely new classes without repeating old classes for a second time. These ones, my current thought is I would probably kickstart them. I do not know yet for sure. And so the hope is that once we have all 4 of these rule sets out, Advent, Aspirant, Adept, Ace, that will show the game as we have seen it in Legacy for so long in its totality, and we can just commit our time to churning out classes. Tons and tons and tons of classes. Let me see if I can pull up my notes on this. I've been working on this for a little while. I'll make it nice and small. There we go. Okay. This is my current plans for my classes. I'm working on this right now. I have, to give you an idea, just in terms of the text you see right here, all these ones are ones that I'm almost 100% sure could work at Aspirant level. These ones are ones I think could work at Adept level. These are ones I think could work at Ace level. These ones I need to take more time to think about, and these ones are as of yet unclassified, and there's some other stuff down here. In total, on this list, I would say I have comfortably over 300 class ideas. And On top of all of that, something that I'm going to be creating the framework for, either in Adept or maybe I'll have it as a stretch goal for Aspirant Edition, is giving people the like a framework and an ability to make their own classes. That's been a huge part of Enclave for a while. In Legacy, I would say when I was like hosting regularly, we had like a fifth of all classes player created in nature, which was sick and it's so fun. And on top of that, I'm going to see if, again, can't promise this one, but I'd like to try it, about in future having players and you guys out in the server and out on the channel and beyond to submit classes for addition into the game. Like, be able to get your own class into the game after, like, maybe going through a design process with me after some sort of initial poll and see what we come up with, you know what I mean? I think that could be sick, like unbelievably fun. And I mean, I love community engagement, but this is just like taking it to the next level. And it continues a proud tradition that we have had in Legacy for quite some time. So that is a summary of Enclave's future roadmap. In terms of what I'm doing next year, the only thing that I am 100% locked into for next year is by January, I'm going to have fulfillments all done, barring some sort of disaster. I have some exciting news on that I'm hopefully going to be able to share with you guys sometime this week. And besides that, and getting all the fulfillments for this campaign done, the only things that I am committed to doing are continuing to try to record feature missions and engage with the server as much as I possibly can. Maybe put out some other Enclave-related content on YouTube and similar. And on top of that, cons. I'm signed up to, I think, 2 or 3 local conventions that I'm locked into going to. And I'm, on top of that, going to be trying to meet and talk with and do content with other great creators like some of the wonderful people I've met in process of doing this particular campaign. So that's all I have guaranteed for next year. But I think that even if it's not guaranteed, I'm going to be trying my utmost to get the aspirant rule set to a point where it can at least start to be play tested next year. How exactly and whether that pans out remains to be seen. I saw a comment. Dieter says, Paxa? Okay. Paxa is something I would like to do maybe the year after next, because I don't know, it's kind of intimidating. And I want to try to, I had my first con in like 4 or 5 years, just like last month for this project. And so I want to like do a couple small ones and get myself like reacquainted with the process, then commit to Paxa and see what I can do. I think it's like I also think there's a wait list. So I did get on the wait list at the very least. It is something I do want to do, especially since it's relatively local to me. So that is my roadmap for Enclave. 3 more editions, hypothetically hundreds of more classes, pre-constructed content like missions and settings like I wouldn't believe. I even have plans to do like pre-constructed like monsters and antagonists. If you've been following some of the actual play videos I've been putting out, you know that I have no shortage of those that I'd love to share. And just generally, I wanted to set up Enclave to be a game that I could make content for as long as I wanted without ever running out of space to do so. And that's definitely what Legacy has been for me for quite some time. And now I get to convert it to you guys and see what happens. Okay, that's a good summary. I got a couple other questions in my own in DMs and stuff like that. I'll take a brief look at general in case there's something here. Yeah, you're good, dear. And if you guys have any other final questions, then shoot them out here. Otherwise, I'm going to look at the ones that have come in while I've been blabbing. Okay, what do we got here? Okay, yeah, that's an interesting one. All right. I mentioned casually in the server that I felt like the Wanderer was kind of the poster child for Enclave, at least for this edition. And why? So why did I say that? So my thoughts on the Wanderer is, one, the class is quite flexible in its theming. It's fun, it's whimsical, and it's very indirect in its playstyle, as well as, of course, having substantial ability to interface directly with the plot. And these are all things that I think are quite emblematic of the way Enclave plays. It is a game that you can you understand it quickly as you're playing it, but there's a whole different set of strategy, a whole different strategic thinking required to master it. A lot of emphasizing social more than you might normally expect. A lot of trying to pull these really clever, interesting moves that you probably wouldn't work in other games from everything I've seen, but Enclave actively incentivizes and rewards it. And I just think that the Wanderer does a lot of those things particularly well. It is certainly not the only class I would say is emblematic of Enclave, but of these 6, it's the one that I think summarizes the game's selling points the most. Maybe rivaled by the Librarian, but I think the Wanderer is a little more accessible than the Librarian. Excellent question. All right. Okay, here's another one. What is the difference between class gear and common items? And if I want my character to wear clothing, does that have to be a common item? No, not at all. So the idea that I have is that anything of your character's appearance that does not have substantial mechanical impact, you don't have to specify that at all until it becomes relevant, unless you choose to in advance when you're creating your character. If you say that part of your character's appearance is that they wear a sword, and you don't have that listed as a common item or a piece of class gear, I'd probably be like, okay, we gotta commit a common item to that, because you can draw that thing and have there's a lot you can do with that, right? But for just things like what your character is wearing and stuff like that, while that can be relevant and is more likely to be relevant in Enclave than in many other games, aesthetics matter, people. They're really, really important. What was I saying? Yeah, while aesthetics matter a lot, they do not have concrete mechanical effect in the way that an explicit sword might. And so because of that, you may also notice that the difference between... Okay, pivoting to the next one. The difference between common items and class gear. Class gear is very explicitly supernatural and is considered to be strictly better than any mundane equivalent. Common items have to be mundane unless they would be completely worthless without some sort of magical property. Something that we have experimented with on missions, not something that I explicitly put in Advent Edition, but something that I'd encourage you guys to play around with, is if you have a really cool idea for a common item, and it's a very weak one, but you just don't have a great idea for an explicit magical effect, you can be a little more vague with it. You can say, hey, can we just not define a magical effect for this yet and then let one come up if it happens? I think that's a very appropriate way of doing that. That came up the other day with the character Hellspawn. So I think that's a very appropriate way of going about defining a common item's magical properties if it deserves one. And again, common items should only get magical properties if they would be well and truly worthless without them. Again, the example I go to is business cards. Yes, in the real world, they're very useful, but in an Enclave context, that thing's not going to do very much for you unless you have some little extra magical oomphiness going on behind it. So, in summary, class gear, strong, supernatural, strictly better than a mundane equivalent. Common item, mundane unless useless without magic. And then your clothing, your stuff your character is wearing, can be either defined during character creation with no explicit rules surrounding it, besides the fact that it cannot be directly mechanically or have any concrete mechanical impact. I probably should have put that in this edition. That's something I'll have to put in aspirant, I suppose. Okay, if you guys have any other questions, make sure to fire them away right now. I'll be trying to consult chat as much as I can, and I'm going to look at the last couple that I had stored for myself. I've gone through all the ones that I got sent in DMs leading up to this, and I only have a few left that have come up consistently enough that I want to make sure I can address them. Let's say, pardon me, just going to click into it. Okay, that's a good one. I like that question. Okay, why does the Enclave teleport you direct? Why isn't there a travel sequence in Enclave? Why do characters just appear on a mission directly? This is something that very, very early players will remember I toyed with during the very beginning of the mission. Very beginning of the mission that is this game, the very beginning of this game's development. It ended up being entirely unfeasible to have a travel session or a travel sequence in a game that is meant to be played in one-shots. And I very quickly realized early on in the game's development that it was very important that you be able to finish something in a single session, both for scheduling's sake and also for pacing's sake. Yes, you can do multi-session things in Enclave, but having the game primarily work around one-shots is very freeing in terms of scheduling and accessibility, which is absolutely huge. And if the game can hold up in a one-shot, it can easily hold up in long form. That's what I kind of came to. And so travel sequences just eat too much time. And because of that, much better to just get your players directly into the action. If you want to give them a little bit of ambiance, teleport them like just a little bit outside of the action so that you can give some framing, you can give them a moment to kind of approach where they're going and to kind of take it all in and maybe do some clever interfacing. But don't make it too far away because they will get sidetracked and all of a sudden it's been half an hour and you're like not even close to starting on the thing that you were trying to do. Quick question in chat. Any progress on deciding which classes are going in Aspirant? I revealed my zoomed out notes for class design earlier. I have, let me do a quick count here. I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. There are about 30 classes I'm strongly considering, of which there are 2 that are all but guaranteed. I don't know if I want to say them in case it doesn't work out. Screw it, I think I will. So the 2 classes that are pretty much guaranteed to come in are the 2 that were in the first stretch goal for Advent Edition, namely the Berserker and the Infiltrator. The Berserker is double plus might plus resilience and is a very high power frontline brawler, largely kind of like Dark Age and earlier primal focused sort of theming. And one of the most interesting pieces about the Berserker is that it features a trance mechanic where you go into a battle rage, a battle frenzy. And trances are another collaborative storytelling mechanic similar to pitches, insights, and turning points that I plan on introducing in Aspirant as one of the new things being added there. Trances have gone through a lot of changes over the course of Legacy Enclave's history, but I've come to a design for them that I think is going to work great for this edition, like this version of the game. So the Berserker, pretty much guaranteed. I think we'll round out the cast well. And the other one, the other of the two first class stretch goals for this edition was the Illusionist, the Infiltrator. The Infiltrator is a double plus reflex plus intelligence class. It is a roughly futuristic themed stealth and kind of information gathering class that has some kind of more conventional, like roguish, break-in, assassin-y elements, but is even more focused on things like deceiving enemies and kind of finding your way in amongst them and kind of hiding yourselves in their ranks, getting information and sending it to your allies to coordinate them, and helping your allies kind of move around undetected within the enemy's camp, so to speak, and also delayed interference and or powerful interference and disruption methods that are on a delay so that they're not instantaneous. The Infiltrator is a class that also, actually Lethal Butterfly and I did a little work designing way back in the day, and I have another iteration of the design that I'm quite happy with. So I'd say Berserker and Infiltrator are by far and away the most likely. Something that a couple people have said is, I really wanted to have a rogue in Advent Edition. Can we have a rogue in Aspirant? And the Infiltrator is probably going to be the closest to that. The Illusionist is quite close. Like, it does scratch a similar itch in this edition, but people want something more precise, and I think the Infiltrator will give that. For the Berserker, I think, big, beefy, melee combat damage dude is something you can kind of do with the Thane, but again, it's not the same. I think the Berserker is going to be well received. So those 2, I think, is almost guaranteed, again, that those will be getting in. But I do not know the others. And again, I'm going to be making sure that you guys have a chance to vote on them, unless I see something that is just too important to put in that I can't risk it not being voted on. Another question. Are there any classes that would be too hard and unbalanced to put in the game at any point? Are there some classes that just won't work anymore? Yes, absolutely. And the reason for it is that in Legacy Enclave, we at one point had we still do in there. I haven't played Legacy in a while, but I imagine we still do. We had a very established overarching unifying theory, both of how magic works and also kind of extraplanar stuff. So there was a lot more established world building done in that game that I purposely wanted to get away from in this edition. I might like drip feed it eventually in very small doses, but only in such a way that playgroups can adapt it and adjust it to whatever they want. I really want to make sure there is never a wrong answer for world building stuff in Enclave. And so because of that, there are some kind of world building focused classes, so to speak, that fit into those unifying theories that would not work anymore. One of the classic examples, do I want to get into this? I think Lethal knows what I'm hemming and hawing over. I'll do it. Okay, one of these would be a class called the Zerum. The Zerum is quite an infamous class. Yeah, exactly. So just know what I'm about to say is absolutely not the case in this edition of Enclave. It is cool, and if I do reintroduce the Zerum, it's going to look very different from what I'm describing now, and will be a lot more flexible on the world building front. Disclaimer out of the way, here's what we had. So in the Enclave cosmology we had established in Legacy, there was this kind of interplanar force called Null. And Null was a consumptive force, highly, highly dangerous. A couple missions involved dealing with Null incursions into the mortal plane. The Zerum was a class that was able to more directly interface with Null, a class that was kind of grounded in the idea of nothingness and working with the negative, not antimatter, but like the negative existence between planes. And the Zerum, first of all, was hideously broken. Like, we tried to redesign it a couple times, just always too strong. Because it turns out when you have a class that can, like, with some work, erase things from existence, that's just always disgusting. So if I were to reintroduce the Zerum, it would probably be one of the very last classes I ever put into the game. Very fitting. And it would also, rather than be just about this world building stuff, this Null that I'd been discussing, but it would also probably lean more into like a more generic idea of kind of the concept of nothingness and wielding nothingness and the idea of zero. Because it's cool grounding, but it's also very specific. And I like grounding that's a lot more accessible and has, like these days at least in my design, I like grounding that's a lot more accessible and a lot more grounded in kind of in cultural artifacts. That's part of the reason that I list all those like characters that you might know who would fit for this class, because when I design classes, I like to do research on where those tropes exist out in the world and try to draw abilities and powers directly from those. And for a class like the Zerum, grounding is tenuous if I remove the world building element from it. So roundabout way of saying, yes, there are classes that are just not going to work for this edition of Enclave rather than Legacy, but I'm fond enough of many of them that I will try to make them work eventually, though they will look very, very different, I can assure you. Excellent question. If you guys have other questions, fire them off away as well. Let's see. So we went over advanced abilities, we went over expanded gear. Oh, this is an interesting one. Something else that's going to be happening in Aspirant Edition is that class gear is also going to be, because the question asked about class gear earlier got my noggin jogging. Class gear is also going to be expanded in terms of its power and what it can get away with. And one of the ways it's going to be doing this is with something called an enchantment. So class gear, in addition to being just better than a mundane equivalent and having a couple of baked-in supernatural properties, will also have a very explicit magical effect on it called an enchantment. And this enchantment is going to be bound to that item in some way. So I've tried to reference some of the enchantments in this Advent Edition's iteration of these items, like the coach gun on the gunslinger. When you shoot, you get to like dash a short distance. That would be an enchantment in Aspirant Edition. But the thing with these enchantments is if you want, you can replace them with your own designs, allowing you to customize your gear in much more fine-tuned ways, and really allowing you to inject a lot of color and personality into your given character, such that two characters with the exact same loot will probably look completely different in practice because of how they have likely customized their enchantments different from each other. So that's something else we're going to be doing with that. Event Horizon, yeah. Event Horizon, Lethal is saying, is referencing Event Horizon. That was an ability on the Zerom class that was that wasn't even the most broken one on them. It was still disgusting, but it wasn't even the worst thing that was about that class from a design perspective. And again, fire off any other questions that you might have. I have one other question coming in through a DM that I just got here. That's very nice of you. Okay, I'll just read the question portion. When you are designing a mission, what is the most important thing to account for besides what is already written in the book? Okay, that's a good question. I have to remember what I put in the book at this point. Let me check my notes. It's a really good question, but one of the best ways I can answer that will be looking at my notes of stuff that I want to put into Aspirant and see, oh, okay, there's some obvious ones there. Okay, here's a good one. Maps. It's very tempting to draw maps of anywhere you are going because since Enclave is a verbal game, it can often be hard to kind of figure out where people are spatially in relation to each other. And for certain classes, this is obviously very important. Like the gunslinger really cares about angles and positioning, and because of that, it can be tempting to make a map for a gunslinger whenever you have one on a mission. I would really encourage people don't make maps all the time. I make maps and have made maps plenty of times. They can be really helpful, really good for certain missions, especially missions that you know are going to rely a lot on very specific positioning, and also on missions that take place over multiple sessions, because that way when they come back, you can point to the map and say, here's where you were, here's where you're going. That's very useful. But when you make a map for everything, it kind of removes an element of flexibility from the game and makes the plot a lot less malleable to your purposes. Like, for example, if your players are doing really good work, and you want to let them get away with something, it can be harder to do so when there is a map there that you have to kind of work around the logic of. Like, you can still kind of wiggle with it a little bit, but it's not something that I personally recommend until you are very, very confident with your conduiting style and know how to work around the innate limitations that having something tangible like a map would present. A nice middle ground that I often recommend is what I call a verbal map, where you say, okay, they're going to a manor. I'm going to list out all of the different rooms in this manor that they might go to in order of how likely they are to go into it. So, the atrium, and then there's the dining room, and then on the first floor there's also a parlor and a kitchen and a veranda, but then they can also go upstairs, and here's what's on the second floor. That can work well. Also not necessary, but it does allow for a lot more flexibility. So I like maps, especially verbal maps. Just make sure you use them sparingly unless you really, really like having it as part of your specific hosting style. And even if you do, I'd say try to make sure that you're as flexible as possible with how you set up your maps so that you leave yourself wiggle room where you need it. For example, when I draw maps, one of the rules I have for myself is I'm not allowed to spend more than 15 minutes on a map. So I just have to scribble and see what comes out. And I find that there are some exceptions, especially, again, a multi-session mission or something like that. But for the most part, I really like to be very finite in the maps that I make for myself. That was an excellent question. All right, if you guys in chat have any other questions, throw them out now. And barring that, I think... Oh, excellent. I got another question. How big is the world of Manifold? Is it Jupiter-sized or more like Plane of Existence that is infinite? It's all of the above. Something that, again, in Legacy we explored was the idea of trying to define Manifold. Is this mission setting that we went to adjacent to this other mission setting we went to? And if you're in space and you look at Manifold, what does it look like? And so we've played around with that sort of thing before, but what I always came to is that it would kind of lead to these logical breaks that would not only limit your creativity and your ability to design missions, because you'd have to be thinking, oh, well, how does this play into the grander scheme of Manifold? And how can I set a mission in space if they look down, it's just like a gigantic plate because it's so big? So I purposefully avoided defining that. You could, if you want to define Manifold for yourself, you could totally have it be like Jupiter size. You could totally have it be an infinite flat plane of existence if you wanted. You could have it be, from the outside, seemingly a normal-sized planet. And then when you dive down into it, you start to realize that there's just more and more and more. I think that if I had to pick, that last one would be my preferred interpretation. If you were in a spaceship looking at Manifold, it would look fairly normal-sized, like Earth-sized. And you'd even be able to make out all sorts of places that were familiar to that given character. But when they dove down and they went to onto Manifold, and they started just kind of pushing the horizon and exploring out, they'd start to see stuff that they didn't see while they were up in space. So Schrodinger's world, perhaps. I'm probably misusing that one. So yeah, in summary, I keep it purposefully undefined such that playgroups are able to set their own parameters for it. I personally like the more esoteric interpretation, where it is all of the above. Depending on what I need, because non-Euclidean as planet. But there is a practical reason for that. The practical reason is because it gives you as a conduit a lot more ability to have control over your setting and what you are doing in the world without having to be worried about all the implications that will follow from that. Fantastic questions, guys. Thank you so much to everyone who sent me in a question. I really enjoyed reading them. Thank you so much to everyone who has asked me stuff about Enclave at conventions and in the questions chat. Thank you so much to everyone who has been playing the game over the years. I cannot believe that it has been a decade. This is a climactic moment in the game, and so very fitting that this would come when we have just fulfilled the PDFs and the hard copies are at the printer. I have, again, news that I'm going to be hopefully sending out to you guys in the not too distant future about that. But until that point, my name is Robbie Howell, and ciao for now.